Chapter 1. The Weight of the Gavel. What kind of justice lets a man choke his own shadow without ever seeing the face behind it? And what happens when that shadow turns out to hold the gavel that could crush his world? In the humid sprawl of Houston, Texas, where the air clung to your skin like a second guilt, Evelyn Brooks stepped out of her modest sedan and adjusted the black robe that draped her frame. It was a Monday in late August, the kind of day where the sun didn't just shine, it bore down, pressing on the cracked pavement of the Harris County Courthouse parking lot. At 42, Evelyn carried herself with a quiet authority, her natural curls pulled into a tight bun, her dark eyes sharp enough to cut through the haze of bureaucracy she'd fought her whole life to rise above. But today wasn't just another day in court. It was the beginning of something seismic, a tremor she couldn't yet feel but was destined to shake the foundations of everything she'd built. Born in the shadow of Fifth Ward, Houston's roughest corner, Evelyn's earliest memory wasn't of playgrounds or lullabies. It was the sound of her father's voice, low, steady, pleading, through the bars of a holding cell where he'd been locked up on a trumped-up loitering charge. A civil rights organizer with a knack for riling up the wrong people. Jeremiah Brooks had been a target for years until one night he didn't come home. Evelyn was 6 then, clinging to her mother's skirt as they stood outside the precinct, the cold metal of the bars reflecting the streetlights like a cage for their hope. Her mother, Ruth, a seamstress with hands toughened by years of stitching dreams into threadbare reality, raised Evelyn and her 2 brothers alone after that. Jeremiah died in custody 2 years later. A heart attack, the coroner called it. Though the bruises on his body told a different story. No one was ever held accountable. That was the first lesson Evelyn learned about justice. It wasn't blind, it just chose who to see. She'd clawed her way out of Fifth Ward through sheer will, acing exams while her classmates dropped out, working night shifts at a diner to pay for law school while her peers partied. Every step was a battle against the whispers, she's too loud, too angry, too black, and the assumptions that trailed her like shadows. When she passed the bar, a white colleague clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Good for you, making it out of there," as if her success was a fluke, not a triumph. When she was appointed judge 5 years ago, the whispers turned to murmurs in the courthouse halls. Affirmative action higher. She'll crack under pressure, even now. As she walked toward the towering limestone facade of the courthouse, a janitor mistook her for a clerk and handed her a mop with a mumbled, "Miss, you missed a spot." She'd smiled tightly, handed it back, and said, "I think you've got the wrong person." Her voice calm but edged with steel. He'd blinked, flustered, and shuffled off, but the sting lingered. It always did. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with its usual chaos, lawyers in crisp suits weaving through the lobby, clerks juggling stacks of files, the faint hum of air conditioning battling the Texas heat. Evelyn's heels clicked against the polished marble floor, a steady rhythm that grounded her as she headed toward her chambers. Her docket today was heavy, but one case loomed larger than the rest. State versus Officers Martinez, Collins, and Pierce, 3 cops accused of beating a black teenager, Jamal Carter, to death during a traffic stop 6 months ago. The body cam footage was grainy, the audio conveniently malfunctioning, but the autopsy showed fractured ribs, a shattered jaw, and a brain hemorrhage. The officers claimed self-defense. Jamal had reached for something, but the only thing found in his car was a half-eaten burger and a textbook for his community college class. The case had sparked protests across Houston, with signs reading "Justice for Jamal" plastered on every corner. Evelyn had been assigned to preside, a decision that sent ripples of unease through the courthouse's old guard. Too close to home, one senior judge had muttered at a meeting, his eyes flicking to her as if her skin disqualified her from impartiality. She didn't flinch at the assignment. If anything, it fueled her. Evelyn had seen too many Jamals, boys who looked like her brothers, men who could have been her father, buried under the weight of a system that didn't blink at their loss. She'd built her career on precision, on wielding the law like a scalpel to carve out justice where others saw only statistics. But she knew the stakes. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spotlight on her. A test of whether a black woman in a robe could hold the line against a city itching to look the other way. Across town, in a dimly lit precinct locker room, James Callahan adjusted his badge, the polished metal glinting under fluorescent lights. At 50, he was a relic of an older Houston, square-jawed, broad-shouldered, with ice-blue eyes that could silence a room. 20 years on the force had hardened him, etched lines into his face that spoke of nights spent chasing shadows and days spent bending them to his will. To Callahan, the badge wasn't just a job, it was a birthright. He'd grown up in a working-class white neighborhood where cops were heroes, where order meant keeping certain people in their place. His father had been a beat cop too, regaling him with stories of cleaning up the streets in the 70s, when Fifth Ward was a place you didn't go unless you were armed. Callahan inherited that worldview. The world worked best when everyone knew their lane, and he'd spent his career making sure they stayed there. His record wasn't spotless. Complaints of excessive force dotted his file like stains on a worn shirt, but they'd always been scrubbed clean. A chokehold here, a broken arm there, all dismissed as necessary by brass who saw him as one of their own. He'd put away drug dealers, pimps, and thieves, racking up commendations that outweighed the whispers. To his peers, he was a cop's cop, the kind you wanted on your side in a firefight. To the black families in Fifth Ward, he was a specter, a name spoken in hushed tones after lights out. But Callahan didn't care about whispers. He cared about control. Lately, though, that control felt shaky. The Martinez case had the precinct on edge, 3 of his old patrol buddies facing prison, their fates in the hands of a judge he'd never met but already despised. Word had trickled down. Evelyn Brooks, a black woman from the wrong side of town, was calling the shots. Callahan didn't buy it. Judges like her didn't belong in cases like this, too soft, too biased. To them, he'd known Martinez and Collins since the academy. They were rough around the edges. Sure, but they didn't deserve to be crucified for doing their job. Pierce, the rookie, had just followed orders. The kid, Jamal, tragic. But these things happened when you didn't comply. That's what Callahan told himself. What he'd told his buddies over beers last night as they cursed the protests and the woke crowd trying to burn them all down. He wasn't on the docket today, but he'd volunteered to pull security at the courthouse anyway. Something about the case gnawed at him, a itch he couldn't scratch. Maybe it was the chance to see this Brooks woman up close, to size her up, to remind her that the real power didn't sit behind a bench, it walked the streets, wore a badge, and answered to no one. As he strapped on his duty belt, the weight of his Glock settled against his hip like an old friend. He caught his reflection in the locker room mirror and smirked. Whatever happened in that courthouse today, James Callahan wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Outside, the Houston skyline shimmered in the heat, a city of glass and grit holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, Evelyn Brooks climbed the stairs to her chambers, her robe swaying like a shield. Neither of them knew it yet, but their collision was coming, fast, brutal, and unstoppable. And when it hit, it wouldn't just break one of them, it would break everything. Chapter 2. The line in the sand. What does a man do when the rules he's lived by start bending under the weight of someone he'd never let cross his path? And what happens when that someone refuses to blink first? The Harris County Courthouse loomed against the Houston sky like a monolith of order, its limestone walls soaking in the morning heat as Evelyn Brooks pushed through the heavy glass doors. Her briefcase swung lightly in her hand, a slim leather shield against the chaos she knew awaited her inside. The lobby was a hive, attorneys barking into phones, clerks scurrying with armloads of files, the air thick with the scent of coffee and old paper. She moved through it with purpose, her heels striking the marble floor like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Today wasn't about the big trial yet, it was a preliminary hearing. A smaller case involving a bar fight gone wrong. But the weight of State versus Martinez hung over her like a storm cloud, its shadow darkening every step. She approached the security checkpoint, a metal arch flanked by 2 officers in crisp blue uniforms. One was young, barely out of the academy, his eyes darting nervously as he waved people through. The other was James Callahan, his broad frame filling the space like a wall, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Evelyn didn't know him by name, not yet, but she knew his type. The way he stood, legs planted wide, hands resting near his belt, exuded a quiet menace, a dare to anyone who might test him. She'd seen it 100 times growing up. Men who wore authority like armor. Who thought a uniform made them untouchable. As she neared, his gaze locked onto her, cold and unyielding, sizing her up like she was a suspect instead of a judge. "Ma'am," Callahan said, his voice a low growl. "Step through the detector." He gestured to the arch with a flick of his hand. His tone clipped, devoid of respect. Evelyn paused, her fingers tightening around the briefcase handle. Judges were exempt from security screenings, a protocol every officer in this building knew by heart. She'd walked through these doors for years without so much as a glance at the machine. But Callahan's eyes told her this wasn't about protocol. It was about power. "I'm Judge Brooks," she said evenly, holding his stare. "I don't go through security." Her voice carried the weight of her title, calm but firm, a line drawn in the sand. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near the scanner as if unsure whether to intervene. A few heads turned in the lobby, lawyers pausing mid-conversation. A clerk peeking over a stack of files, but no one spoke. The air thickened, a silent standoff stretching between them. Callahan tilted his head, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Everyone goes through security," he said, stepping closer, his bulk casting a shadow over her. "No exceptions." His words dripped with challenge, the kind of bait she'd learned to sidestep her whole life. She could hear the subtext loud and clear: "You don't belong here. And I'm gonna prove it." Evelyn inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She'd dealt with men like him before, cops who flexed their badges like fists, who saw her robe as a costume instead of a mantle. But today, with the Martinez case looming, she couldn't let it slide. "Are you stopping every judge this morning?" "Officer." She glanced at his badge. "Callahan? Or just me?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, cutting through his bravado. The younger officer coughed, his eyes flicking between them. But Callahan didn't flinch, his jaw tightened, a muscle twitching under the stubble. And for a moment, she thought he might push it further, step into her space, raise his voice, make a scene. Instead, he leaned in just enough for her to catch the faint scent of tobacco on his breath. "I'm doing my job," he said, his voice low, almost a hiss. "Maybe you should do yours and stop making this harder than it needs to be." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, a jab at her authority, her presence, her very existence in this building. Evelyn's pulse quickened, but she kept her face a mask of calm. She'd learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every move she made was watched, judged, dissected. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "She's good to go," the younger officer muttered, barely audible, his hand waving her through. "Judges don't need to." Callahan shot him a look that could have cracked glass. And the kid shrank back, his words dying in his throat. But the interruption was enough. Evelyn stepped forward, brushing past Callahan without breaking eye contact, her robe grazing his arm as she moved. She felt his gaze burning into her back as she walked away, the heat of his resentment trailing her like a ghost. She'd won this round, but she knew it wasn't over. Men like him didn't forget a slight, they nursed it, let it fester, waited for the chance to strike back. In her chambers, Evelyn set her briefcase on the desk and exhaled, rolling her shoulders to shake off the encounter. The room was her sanctuary, bookshelves lined with legal tomes, a framed photo of her mother smiling on a rare good day, a gavel resting on a wooden stand like a silent promise. She sank into her chair, her mind already shifting to the day ahead, when her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Thompson, her clerk and protege. "Heads up, Callahan's on the witness list for the bar fight case. Might get messy." She frowned, the name sinking in. So he wasn't just a gatekeeper today, he'd be in her courtroom, under her gavel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Meanwhile, Callahan stormed out of the courthouse lobby, his boots pounding the pavement as he headed for his patrol car. The kid, Officer Diaz, had undermined him, and that judge, Brooks, had walked away like she owned the place. His fingers flexed at his sides, itching for something to hit. He'd volunteered for this shift to get a read on her, to see what they were up against with the Martinez case breathing down their necks. Now he had his answer. She was trouble. The kind that didn't bend, didn't break, didn't know her place. And that made her dangerous. He slid into the driver's seat and pulled out his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. Hayes, he barked when the line picked up. Richard Hayes, his old partner from the academy, now a lieutenant with pull in the precinct, was the one man Callahan trusted to have his back. It's me, that Judge, Brooks. She's gonna be a problem. We need to talk. Already heard, Hayes replied, his voice smooth, calculating. She's digging into Martinez hard. Word is, she's got the DA sniffing around too. What happened in there? She thinks she's untouchable, Callahan said, his grip tightening on the wheel. Made me look like a damn fool in front of half the lobby. We can't let her run this show. Hayes was quiet for a moment, the silence heavy with intent. We won't, he said finally. Meet me tonight. Bring the others. We've got a witness lined up, some junkie who'll say whatever we want about that Carter kid. But Brooks, she's not gonna back off easy. We might need to push harder. Her family's still in Fifth Ward, Callahan said, a dark edge creeping into his voice. Mother's old, lives alone, easy target. Hayes chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. Smart man. Let's start there. Keep her distracted. Keep her scared. She'll fold. Callahan ended the call and leaned back, staring at the courthouse through the windshield. He didn't like getting dirty, not like this, but Brooks had drawn first blood. If she wanted a fight, he'd give her one, and when it was over, she'd wish she'd stayed on the other side of that detector, where he could have kept her in line. Inside, Evelyn opened her laptop, pulling up the case files for the day. Callahan's name stared back at her from the witness list, a bolded line in black ink. She didn't know what he was planning, but she knew one thing for sure. He'd underestimated her, and that was his first mistake. Chapter 3. The Gavel Falls. How far will a man go to keep the world he knows from slipping through his fingers? And what happens when the one holding the hammer refuses to let it drop? The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale tension as Evelyn Brooks ascended the bench, her black robe settling around her like a cloak of resolve. The chamber was modest, rows of worn pews, a flickering fluorescent light overhead, a faded American flag drooping in the corner, but it was hers. Today's case was a bar fight turned assault charge, a routine hearing that should have been a blip on her radar. But the name James Callahan on the witness list had turned it into something else, a battlefield. She adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping the room, attorneys shuffling papers. The defendant slouched in an ill-fitting suit, a handful of spectators whispering in the back. And then there he was, sitting stiffly in the witness box, his uniform crisp, his blue eyes locked on her with a mix of defiance and disdain. Callahan hadn't expected this. He'd signed up to testify about a brawl he'd broken up 2 months ago, a drunk swinging a bottle at another over a spilled drink. Nothing complicated. He'd figured it'd be quick. A chance to flex his authority and get a closer look at this Judge Brooks everyone was buzzing about. But now, staring up at her from the witness stand, he felt the ground shift. She wasn't just some clerk or lawyer he could bulldoze, she was the one in charge. Perched above him, her presence a quiet storm he hadn't braced for. The memory of their clash at the security checkpoint burned in his gut, a fresh wound to his pride. He clenched his fists under the table, waiting for her to make the first move. Evelyn tapped her gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the room. Court is in session, she said, her voice steady, cutting through the hum of anticipation. We're here for State versus Daniel Rivera. Officer Callahan, you're called as a witness for the prosecution. Please state your name and occupation for the record. James Callahan, he said, his tone clipped, leaning slightly into the microphone. Police officer, Houston PD, 20 years on the force. He kept his eyes on her, daring her to challenge him again. She didn't flinch, just nodded and gestured for the prosecutor to begin. The attorney, a wiry man named Gregson, stood and walked Callahan through the incident, where he'd been, what he'd seen, how he'd subdued Rivera with minimal force. It was a script Callahan knew by heart, one he'd recited dozens of times in courtrooms like this. But Evelyn wasn't listening like the others. Her pen scratched notes on a legal pad, her brow furrowing at details he glossed over. Did you strike the defendant? She interjected suddenly, her voice slicing through Gregson's next question. The room stilled. Callahan blinked, caught off guard, his jaw tightening. Only when he swung at me. he said, his words measured but edged with irritation. He was resisting. I had to control the situation. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The report says he was already on the ground when you used your baton. Care to explain that? A murmur rippled through the spectators. Gregson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Callahan like he'd stepped on a landmine. The officer's nostrils flared, his fingers digging into the wooden edge of the stand. He was still fighting, Callahan said, his voice rising a notch. You don't wait for a guy to get up and take another swing. That's how cops get killed. So you hit him while he was down. Evelyn pressed, her tone calm but unrelenting. How many times? Callahan's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple. As many as it took. He snapped, the words bursting out before he could reel them in. The courtroom erupted, gasps from the back. A cough from the defense attorney. Gregson rubbing his forehead like he could erase the moment. Evelyn raised her gavel, silencing the noise with a single strike. Officer Callahan, she said, her voice low. Lethal, you're here to testify, not to lecture. Answer the question. How many times? He glared at her, his chest heaving, the weight of her authority pressing down on him like a physical force. 3, he said finally, spitting the word like it burned his tongue. 3 times. Evelyn held his gaze for a long moment, letting the admission hang in the air. Then she nodded, leaning back. Continue, Mr. Gregson. The prosecutor stumbled through the rest of his questions. But the damage was done. Callahan's testimony, meant to be a slam dunk, had cracked under her scrutiny. The defense attorney pounced, painting him as a loose cannon. And by the time he stepped down, Callahan's hands were trembling with barely contained rage. He didn't sit back down quietly. As Evelyn turned to the next witness, Callahan stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This is bullshit, he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. Heads turned. Evelyn froze, her gavel halfway to the bench. Excuse me? She said, her voice a blade. Callahan turned to face her, his eyes blazing. You heard me. You sit up there like you're better than us, picking apart every damn thing we do. I was doing my job, keeping people safe. You don't get to twist that. The room went deathly silent, the kind of quiet that sucks the air out of your lungs. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, but her face remained a mask. She'd heard worse, slurs shouted from pickup trucks, insults whispered behind her back, but never like this. Never in her own courtroom. She set the gavel down, deliberate and slow, and stood, her robe pooling around her like a dark tide. Officer Callahan, she said, her words ringing clear. You're out of line. Sit down, or I'll have you removed. He didn't sit. He took a step forward, his boots thudding against the floor, his voice rising to a snarl. You don't tell me what to do. You think you run this place? You don't belong up there. None of this should be yours. The venom in his words hit like a slap, raw and unfiltered, stripping away any pretense. The spectators gasped. A clerk dropped her pen, and Gregson half rose as if to intervene. But Callahan wasn't done. He lunged toward the bench, his hands slamming down on the edge, inches from her. Evelyn didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her heart racing but her resolve ironclad. Step back, she said, her voice a command wrapped in ice. He didn't. His fingers curled into fists, his breath hot and ragged. And for a split second, she saw it. The edge of a man about to break. Then chaos erupted. Marcus Thompson, her clerk, bolted from his seat at the side, a lean figure in a gray suit, his eyes wide with alarm. Get back, he shouted, grabbing Callahan's arm and yanking him away from the bench. Callahan spun, his fist swinging instinctively, catching Marcus in the jaw with a sickening crack. Marcus stumbled, blood trickling from his lip, but he held his ground, shoving Callahan back. The bailiff, a burly man named Harris, surged forward, wrestling Callahan's arms behind his back as he roared. You can't do this to me. Evelyn slammed her gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Enough, she barked, her voice cutting through the melee. Bailiff, remove him, now. Harris dragged Callahan toward the door, his boots scraping, his curses bouncing off the walls. The room watched in stunned silence as he disappeared, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him. Evelyn exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered herself back into her chair. Marcus wiped his mouth, his chest heaving, meeting her eyes with a nod that said he was okay. The spectators whispered, phones already out, fingers tapping furiously. She knew what was coming: video, headlines, chaos, but right now, she had a courtroom to run. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes, she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She struck the gavel once more and stood, her robes swirling as she retreated to her chambers. Behind her, the room buzzed, a hive kicked over, and outside, James Callahan, pinned against a wall by Harris, felt the first crack in the world he'd built, a world that was about to come crashing down. Chapter 4. The Echoes of Retribution. What drives a man to burn the bridges he's crossed when the other side starts fighting back? And how deep must the roots of vengeance grow before they choke the life out of everything he knows? The holding cell beneath the Harris County Courthouse was a concrete box, its walls stained with years of sweat and regret. James Callahan slumped against the bench, his wrists raw from where the cuffs had bitten into his skin before Harris yanked them off. His uniform was wrinkled now, the badge dulled by the flickering light overhead, but the fire in his chest still roared. He replayed the scene in his head, Brooks on that bench, her voice slicing through him, her clerk daring to put hands on him. The humiliation stung worse than the punch he'd landed, a wound that pulsed with every breath. He'd lost control, and he knew it, but the why of it gnawed at him. She'd pushed him, her questions, her stare, her existence, and now he was here, caged like the men he'd spent 20 years locking away. He wasn't alone for long. The steel door creaked open, and Richard Hayes stepped in, his lieutenant's stripes glinting on his sleeve. Hayes was shorter than Callahan, wiry and sharp-eyed, with a face that could charm a jury or scare a suspect into confession. He carried a styrofoam cup of coffee, the steam curling up like a taunt. "Jesus, Jim," he said, shutting the door behind him. "What the hell was that?" Callahan didn't look up, his hands flexing against his knees. "She had it coming," he muttered, his voice rough, thick with anger, "sitting up there like she owns the place, tearing me apart in front of everyone. I wasn't gonna let her." Hayes set the coffee on the bench and crossed his arms, his expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You let her? Man, you handed her the damn keys. You think Martinez and the boys need this right now? Their trial's in 2 days. And you just turned yourself into Exhibit A for every bleeding heart out there." Callahan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lecture me, Rich. You weren't there. She's gunning for us, digging into shit she shouldn't. I could see it in her face. We need to shut this down." Hayes studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, like a man piecing together a puzzle. "All right," he said, lowering his voice. "We shut it down, but not like that, not in front of a room full of witnesses. You're lucky it's just a suspension for now. Brass is pissed, but they'll cool off if we play this right." "Play it how?" Callahan asked, leaning forward, his pulse quickening. He didn't like being sidelined, didn't like the idea of waiting for someone else to fix this. Hayes smirked, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket and sliding it across the bench. "Her mother," Hayes said, tapping the paper. "Ruth Brooks. Lives alone in 5th Ward, 73 years old. Bad hip. She's the weak spot. We don't touch her, not yet, just rattle her enough to send a message. Brooks backs off the Martinez case, or things get messy." Callahan unfolded the paper, scanning the address scrawled in Hayes' tight script. A slow grin spread across his face. "Dark and jagged. Smart," he said, folding it again and tucking it into his pocket. "Who do we send?" "Already handled," Hayes replied. "Couple of guys from the night shift, low profiles. No paper trail. They'll swing by tonight. Leave a note, maybe break a window. Nothing big, just enough to spook the old lady. Brooks'll get the hint." Callahan nodded, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. It wasn't a fix, not yet, but it was a start. "And if she doesn't?" Hayes' smile faded, his eyes hardening. "Then we escalate, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. You're already on thin ice. Jim, keep your head down till this blows over." The door clanged shut behind Hayes, leaving Callahan alone with the hum of the lights and the weight of the plan. He didn't like hiding behind shadows, didn't like letting others do the dirty work, but Brooks had left him no choice. She'd drawn a line, and he'd cross it, one way or another. Upstairs, Evelyn sat in her chambers. The door locked, the blinds drawn against the prying eyes she knew were out there. Her hands still shook as she poured a glass of water from the pitcher on her desk, the cool liquid doing little to ease the heat in her throat. Marcus sat across from her, a damp cloth pressed to his swollen jaw, his tie loosened, his dark eyes flicking between anger and concern. "You okay?" he asked, his voice muffled by the cloth. At 28, Marcus Thompson was young for a clerk, but he'd earned his spot with a sharp mind and a fire Evelyn recognized from her own past. He'd grown up in Acres Homes, another Houston rough patch, and shadowed her for 2 years, soaking up every lesson she threw his way. "I'm fine," she lied, sipping the water and setting the glass down with a clink. "You shouldn't have jumped in like that. He could have done worse." Marcus snorted, wincing as the movement tugged at his bruise. "Worse than letting him climb over your bench? No chance. Guy's a damn animal. Lost it the second you pushed back." Evelyn leaned back, her fingers tracing the edge of her gavel. "He's not just an animal," she said quietly. "He's scared. Men like Callahan don't snap unless they feel the ground moving under them. This isn't about the bar fight, it's about Martinez. He's protecting something." Marcus lowered the cloth, his brow furrowing. "You think he's tied to those cops?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm gonna find out. He's not walking away from this, not after today." The phone on her desk buzzed, shattering the silence. She glanced at the screen. Sarah Nguyen, a reporter from the Houston Chronicle she'd met during a panel last year. Evelyn hesitated, then answered, "Sarah, now's not a great time. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." Sarah's voice crackled through, urgent and low. "Video of Callahan going off in your courtroom's already online. 500,000 views in 20 minutes. People are losing their minds. I've got sources saying he's been suspended. But there's chatter in the precinct he's not done. You need to watch your back." Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she kept her tone even. "Thanks for the heads up. Can you dig into him? Anything tying him to Martinez, Collins, or Pierce?" "Already on it," Sarah said. "Give me a day. I'll call you when I've got something solid." The line went dead, and Evelyn set the phone down, her mind racing. Marcus watched her, his expression darkening. "What's the play?" he asked. She stood, smoothing her robe, her resolve hardening like steel. "We keep pushing," she said. "Callahan wants a war? He's got one." That night, Ruth Brooks sat in her small Fifth Ward bungalow, the TV flickering with a rerun of Wheel of Fortune. The house was quiet, the only sound the creak of her rocking chair and the hum of cicadas outside. She was a wiry woman, her hair a crown of silver curls, her hands folded over a quilt she'd been stitching for weeks. The knock came soft at first, then louder, rattling the thin door. Ruth frowned, easing herself up with a groan, her hip protesting as she shuffled to the peephole. No one was there, just the empty porch, bathed in the yellow glow of the streetlight. She opened the door a crack, peering out, and froze. A brick lay on the welcome mat, a folded note tied to it with string. She bent slowly, her fingers trembling as she untied it and read the scrawled words. "Tell your daughter to back off. Or this is just the start." The sound of shattering glass exploded behind her, her kitchen window. Now a jagged hole. Ruth stumbled back, her breath catching, the note fluttering to the floor. Across town, Evelyn's phone rang again, her mother's number flashing on the screen. She answered, her heart sinking at the tremor in Ruth's voice. "Baby, someone's been here," Ruth whispered. "They broke my window, left a note. I'm scared." Evelyn gripped the phone, her blood turning to ice. Callahan's face flashed in her mind. His snarl, his fists. "I'm coming," she said, already grabbing her keys. "Lock the doors. Mama, don't open for anyone but me." The line went silent, but the war had just begun. Chapter 5. The storm breaks. What happens when the mask a man wears cracks under the glare of a million eyes? And how does a woman stand tall when the world she's fought for starts to cheer and curse her name? The night air in Fifth Ward was thick with humidity as Evelyn Brooks pulled up to her mother's bungalow, her sedan's tires crunching over gravel. The street lamp cast a sickly yellow glow across the porch, illuminating the brick still lying where Ruth had dropped it, the note fluttering beside it like a wounded bird. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stepped out, her robe swapped for a simple blazer and jeans, her keys clutched like a weapon. She'd driven the 20 minutes from her downtown apartment in a blur. The echo of her mother's trembling voice looping in her mind. The broken kitchen window gaped like a wound in the house she'd grown up in. Shards of glass glinting on the grass. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Ruth met her at the door, her silver curls disheveled, her eyes wide with a fear Evelyn hadn't seen since the night they'd lost her father. "Baby," Ruth whispered, pulling her into a hug that smelled of lavender and worry. "I didn't know what to do. They were gone before I could see him." Evelyn held her tight, her jaw clenching as she scanned the dark street over Ruth's shoulder. "You're okay now," she said, guiding her mother inside and locking the door. "Tell me everything." Ruth recounted the knock, the brick, the shattering glass, her voice shaking but steadying as she spoke. Evelyn picked up the note, her fingers tracing the jagged handwriting. "Tell your daughter to back off. Or this is just the start." She knew who'd sent it, or at least who'd inspired it. Callahan's face loomed in her mind, his snarl from the courtroom now a shadow stretching across her life. "I'm calling the police," she said, pulling out her phone, but Ruth grabbed her arm. "No, Evie," Ruth said, her grip surprisingly firm. "You know how this works. They'll come, take a report, and nothing'll change. Same as with your daddy. This is on you now, you and that Gavel of yours." Evelyn exhaled, the weight of her mother's words sinking in. Ruth was right. The system she'd sworn to uphold had failed them before, failed her father, failed countless others. She couldn't trust it to protect them now, not when the threat came from within its own ranks. She pocketed the note, her resolve hardening. "Then we fight back," she said, "but you're not staying here alone. Pack a bag. You're coming with me." As Ruth shuffled to her room, Evelyn texted Marcus. "Mama's house hit. Callahan's behind it. Meet me at my place. Bring everything you've got." She didn't wait for a reply. She knew he'd come. Then she dialed Sarah Nguyen. "Sarah, it's me. They went after my mother tonight, broke her window. Left a note. This is bigger than the courtroom now." Sarah's voice was sharp, awake despite the hour. "Shit, Evelyn, I'm sorry. I've got something for you." Callahan's name's come up in old files. Excessive force complaints. Hushed up fast. One ties him to Martinez, same beat, same shift. 10 years back. "I'm still digging. But this video's blowing up. It's everywhere. Send me what you have," Evelyn said, her pulse quickening. "And keep pushing. They want me scared. I'm not giving them the satisfaction." By morning, the video of Callahan's courtroom outburst had ignited Houston. Sarah hadn't exaggerated. 500,000 views had ballooned to 2 million overnight. Shared across X, plastered on news sites, dissected on morning shows. The footage was raw. Callahan's lunge at the bench, his fist connecting with Marcus's jaw. Evelyn's gavel slamming down like a thunderclap. Hashtags sprang up. Hashtag justice for Jamal. Hashtag Judge Brooks. Hashtag cop gone rogue. Trending alongside clips of protesters chanting outside the courthouse. The Houston Chronicle ran Sarah's first piece at dawn. Officer's courtroom meltdown raises questions ahead of controversial trial. It didn't name Martinez yet, but the dots were there, waiting to be connected. Evelyn watched it unfold from her apartment, Ruth dozing on the couch with a quilt draped over her. Marcus arrived at 7, his jaw still bruised, a laptop and a stack of files under his arm. "You weren't kidding," he said, dropping into a chair. "This is war now. Look at this." He opened his laptop, pulling up a grainy PDF, an internal memo from 2013. Callahan's name was circled in red, linked to a complaint about a black teenager beaten unconscious during a drug bust. The case had been buried. The kid paid off. Callahan reassigned. "He's got a history," Marcus said, "and I bet Martinez was there too." Evelyn nodded, her eyes scanning the screen. "Sarah's got more coming. If we tie him to those cops, we've got leverage, but we need to move fast, before they hit again." Outside, the city was splitting apart. In Fifth Ward, a crowd gathered near Ruth's house. Neighbors taping up the broken window and planting justice for Jamal signs in the yard. At the precinct, Callahan sat in a borrowed office. His suspension official but his mind racing. Hayes had called at sunrise. His voice tight. You see this shit? They're painting you as the devil. Jim, we need to pivot, fast. They're bluffing. Callahan growled, his fist clenched around a cold coffee mug. Brooks can't prove anything. She doesn't have to. Hayes shot back. That video's doing the work. Protesters are at the courthouse, hundreds of them. And word's out about her mom's place. People are pissed. Callahan stood, pacing the cramped space. Then we double down. That witness, the junkie, you said he's ready? Yeah, Hayes said. He'll swear Jamal pulled a knife. We've got him locked down in a safe house. But if Brooks keeps digging, she won't. Callahan cut in, his voice dark. Not if we make it clear what's at stake. Hit her harder, her car, her office, whatever it takes. Hayes hesitated, then sighed. All right, but you're out of this now. Brass is watching. I'll handle it. The call ended, and Callahan stared out the window. The city sprawling below like a chessboard he was losing control of. He'd underestimated Brooks, thought she'd buckle under a little pressure. Now she was a symbol. And he was the villain. He smashed the mug against the wall, ceramic shards scattering like his plans. By noon, the protests swelled. Outside the courthouse, a sea of faces, black, brown, white, chanted Evelyn's name. Their signs a forest of rage and hope. Someone lit a match, and a makeshift effigy of a cop's badge went up in flames. The crowd roaring as smoke curled into the sky. Evelyn watched from her apartment window. Ruth beside her, their hands clasped. They're with you, baby, Ruth said softly, like they should have been with your daddy. Evelyn squeezed her hand, her throat tight. I'm not doing this for them. Mama, I'm doing it for us. Her phone buzzed. Sarah again. Evelyn, I've got it. Callahan and Martinez worked a case in 13, kid died. Same Mo as Jamal, covered up by Hayes. I'm running it tomorrow unless you say stop. Don't stop, Evelyn said, her voice steel. Burn it down. Across town, Hayes paced his office, his phone pressed to his ear. It's done. A voice crackled through. Her car's trashed, tires slashed. Windshield gone. Notes in the glove box. Last warning. She'll see it soon. Good, Hayes said, exhaling. Let's see her stand tall now. But Evelyn was already moving. She grabbed her keys, kissed Ruth's forehead, and headed for the door. Marcus trailing her. Where we going? He asked, his eyes sharp. To the courthouse, she said, her jaw set. They want a fight? I'm bringing it to them. The storm had broken, and Houston was ablaze. Chapter 6. The verdict of the fallen. What does a man see when the mirror he's trusted his whole life shatters into 1,000 accusing shards? And how does justice weigh the sins of a system when the gavel falls on one of its own? The courtroom was a furnace of anticipation as James Callahan sat at the defendant's table. His hands cuffed, his uniform replaced by a gray jail jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. The Harris County Courthouse had never felt so alive, or so suffocating. Spectators packed the pews, their whispers a low hum beneath the creak of the ceiling fan. Reporters lined the back, pens poised, cameras rolling discreetly from the hall. 2 days had passed since the video of Callahan's outburst went viral. And now, on a sweltering Wednesday morning, he faced the consequences, charges of assault, obstruction of justice, and contempt of court, with more looming if Evelyn's allies could tie him to the Martinez case. Evelyn Brooks sat in her chambers, her robe draped over the chair, her fingers tracing the edge of the note from her mother's porch. She wouldn't preside today. Conflict of interest ruled her out, but she'd be in the gallery. Watching, a silent force in the storm she'd unleashed. Marcus stood by the window, his jaw still shadowed with a bruise, flipping through a stack of files Sarah had sent over. They've got him dead to rights, he said, glancing at her. Assault on me, threatening you, videos airtight. But this, he tapped a page, this old case from 13, it's dynamite. If we can get it in, he's done. Evelyn nodded, her eyes hard. Sarah's running it today. Hazel squirm when it hits. Keep digging. Callahan's not the only one we're after. She stood, smoothing her blazer, and headed for the courtroom. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to see justice done, or at least the start of it. The judge, a grizzled veteran named Hargrove, took the bench with a scowl, his gavel striking once to silence the room. Callahan's lawyer, a slick man named Baxter with a reputation for defending cops, stood to argue for bail. "My client's a decorated officer," Baxter said, his voice smooth as oil. 20 years of service, no prior convictions. This was a lapse in judgment, not a pattern. He's no flight risk. The prosecutor, a young woman named Lena Carter with fire in her eyes, shot back. "A lapse? He assaulted a clerk and threatened a judge in open court, on camera. He's a danger to the system he swore to protect. No bail." Hargrove grunted, his pen scratching notes. But before he could rule, Callahan shifted, his cuffs clinking. His eyes darted to the gallery, locking on Evelyn. She met his gaze, unflinching, her presence a silent challenge. The hearing moved fast, testimony from Marcus. Clips of the video replayed on a screen. Gasps from the crowd as Callahan's fist connected with Marcus's jaw. Baxter tried to spin it. Stress. Provocation. A career under siege. But the evidence was a noose, tightening with every word. Hargrove denied bail, his voice gruff. "You're staying put, officer. Next hearing's in a week. We're done here." The gavel fell, and Callahan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as deputies hauled him up. But the real blow came later. As Evelyn stepped into the hall, Sarah Nguyen intercepted her, her face flushed with urgency. "It's out," she said, thrusting a tablet into Evelyn's hands. The Chronicle headline screamed, "Officer in Courtroom Scandal Linked to Decade-Old Cover-Up." The article detailed a 2013 case, a black teenager, Deshaun Lewis, beaten to death during a raid Callahan led. Martinez had been his partner then. Hayes his sergeant. A witness had recanted under pressure. The family silenced with a payout. The file buried. Sarah's sources, leaked memos. A retired cop's affidavit, blew it wide open. Evelyn's breath caught. "You've got Hayes in here too?" "Dead center," Sarah said. "He signed off on the hush money. This ties them all to Jamal Carter, same playbook. People are gonna riot when they read this." The hall buzzed as the story spread, phones lighting up with notifications. Evelyn handed the tablet back, her mind racing. "Good work. Keep the pressure on." She turned to Marcus, who joined them, his eyes wide. "Get this to Lena. She'll add it to Callahan's charges. We're not stopping at assault." Back in the holding cell, Callahan sat alone. The paper Sarah's article was printed on crumpled in his fist. He'd gotten it from a guard, a kid who'd once looked up to him. The words burned. Cover up. Brutality. Corruption. His name. Martinez's. Hayes. All laid bare. He'd thought he could weather this. Thought the precinct would shield him like always. But the silence from his old crew told a different story. Hayes hadn't called. No one had. The door creaked open, and Hargrove's voice echoed from the hall as a new figure entered, Lena Carter. The prosecutor, her heels clicking with purpose. "James Callahan," she said, her tone cold. "You're being charged with additional counts, conspiracy, evidence tampering, manslaughter from 2013. You've got 5 minutes with your lawyer before we move you." Callahan's head snapped up, his face paling. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lena didn't blink. "Deshaun Lewis. Ring a bell? We've got witnesses, documents, and your prints all over it. You're done." He lunged to his feet, the cuffs yanking him back. "This is Brooks," he snarled. "She's behind this, feeding you lies." "No lies," Lena said, stepping closer, her voice a blade. "Just truth you couldn't bury deep enough. And here's the kicker. Hayes is flipping. He's in custody upstairs, singing like a bird to save his own skin. Said you ran the show back then. Martinez too." Callahan froze, the air sucked out of him. Hayes, his rock, his brother in arms, had turned. The betrayal hit harder than the charges. A knife twisting in his gut. "You're lying," he whispered, but his voice cracked, hollow. "See for yourself," Lena said, nodding to the door as it opened again. Richard Hayes stepped in, flanked by deputies, his face ashen, his lieutenant's stripes dulled by defeat. He wouldn't meet Callahan's eyes. "Rich," Callahan croaked, his hands trembling. "Tell her it's bullshit. Tell her." Hayes swallowed, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Jim. They've got everything, tapes, bank records, I can't go down for this. It was your call, always was. Callahan roared, lunging at Hayes, but the deputies pinned him to the wall, his curses muffled against the concrete. Lena watched, impassive, then turned to leave. Court's in 2 hours, she said over her shoulder. Be ready. Upstairs, Evelyn stood in the gallery as Hayes was led in. His head bowed, the room erupting in gasps and shouts. She'd seen the update from Sarah, Hayes' arrest. His plea deal spilling names, dates, dirt. Callahan's world was collapsing, and hers was rising, but victory felt heavy. She slipped out, heading to her car, or what was left of it. The tires were slashed, the windshield a spiderweb of cracks. A new note taped to the steering wheel. Last warning. She ripped it off, her hands steady despite the rage boiling inside her. Marcus joined her, his eyes narrowing at the wreckage. They're desperate, he said. Hayes flipping changes everything. It does, Evelyn agreed, crumpling the note. But it's not enough. Callahan's just the start. This goes deeper. We're taking them all down. The courtroom doors swung open behind them. Protesters spilling out, their chants a tidal wave. Justice. Justice. Evelyn turned, her silhouette framed against the chaos. Her voice low but resolute. Let's finish this. In the cell below, Callahan slumped against the wall. Hayes' betrayal echoing in his skull. The man he'd been, the cop, the enforcer, was gone. Shattered by the truth he'd run from. And upstairs, Evelyn Brooks stood taller than ever. Her gavel silent but her will a hammer poised to strike. Chapter 7. The Ashes of Order. What becomes of a city when the guardians it trusted turn their shields into swords against the innocent? And how does a woman carry the weight of victory when it's forged from the fires of her own pain? The Houston skyline shimmered under a late September sun. But beneath its gleam, the streets churned with unrest. The Harris County Courthouse stood like a battered sentinel, its steps clogged with protesters, hundreds strong now, their voices a relentless tide crashing against the limestone walls. Signs stabbed the air. Justice for Jamal. No more cover-ups. Brooks for the people. The fallout from Callahan's arrest and Hayes' betrayal had lit a fuse. And the city was ablaze with it. Evelyn Brooks watched from her apartment window, her mother's quilt draped over the couch behind her, the TV muted but flashing images of the chaos she'd helped unleash. It had been 3 days since Hayes flipped, spilling a decade of dirt that buried Callahan and cracked the precinct wide open. The Houston Chronicle ran Sarah Nguyen's exposé like a war drum, each paragraph a blow to the old guard, payoffs, falsified reports, a network of cops shielding their own. Martinez, Collins, and Pierce, the trio facing trial for Jamal Carter's death, were now linked to Callahan's 2013 cover-up of Deshaun Lewis killing. Their defense crumbling under the weight of Hayes' testimony. The DA had added charges. The feds were sniffing around, and the mayor was scrambling to contain the PR nightmare. But for Evelyn, it wasn't over. Not yet. Her car sat in the lot below, a mangled relic of the latest threat, tires slashed, windshield shattered, the last warning note now tucked in an evidence bag Marcus had handed to Lena Carter. Ruth slept in the guest room, her breathing soft but uneven, the ordeal at her bungalow still shadowing her dreams. Evelyn's phone buzzed incessantly, texts from Marcus, calls from Sarah, emails from courthouse brass. One stood out. An offer from the governor's office. Appellate court nomination. Meet next week. She stared at it, the words blurring as her mind spun. A step up, a chance to shape justice beyond Houston. But it came now, in this storm, when every move she made was a lightning rod. Marcus arrived at noon, his bruise fading but his eyes sharp. A laptop bag slung over his shoulder. You see this? He said, setting up on her dining table. He pulled up a live feed, protesters outside the precinct. Some hurling bottles, others kneeling in silent tribute to Jamal and Deshaun. They're calling you a hero. Half the city wants you on a pedestal, the other half wants you gone. Evelyn sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. I didn't ask for this, Marcus. I just wanted the truth. You got it, he said, his voice firm. And now it's bigger than us. Lena's pushing for a grand jury. Hayes gave her names, dates, everything. Callahan's trial's next month, but the precinct's already imploding. 3 resignations this morning. She nodded. her gaze drifting to the quilt. Her mother's hands had stitched it through years of grief. Good, but they're still fighting. That note on my car, they're not done. They're scared, Marcus said, leaning forward. Hayes flipped. The feds are circling. They're rats on a sinking ship. You've got him on the ropes. Maybe, she murmured, but her mind flashed to Ruth's trembling voice. The brick on her porch. Victory tasted bitter when it came at this cost. Her phone buzzed again. Sarah. She answered, bracing herself. Evelyn, you sitting down? Sarah's voice was electric. The governor's fast-tracking your nomination. Public pressure's too hot to ignore. But there's blowback. Conservative blogs are calling you a race-baiting activist. Got death threats coming in too. Email. X, you name it. I'm sending you the worst ones. Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she kept her tone steady. Let him talk. I've heard worse. What about the precinct? Shaking. Sarah said, Hayes' plea deal's public, 10 years. Reduced if he keeps testifying. Callahan's facing life if they pin Deshawn on him. And get this. Someone torched a patrol car outside 5th Ward last night. Note said, for Jamal, shit's hitting the fan. Thanks, Sarah, Evelyn said, ending the call. She turned to Marcus, her jaw set. We need to protect Mama. And I'm not running from this nomination. They want to fight. They'll get one. Across town, James Callahan sat in his cell at the county jail. The concrete walls pressing in like a vice. His jumpsuit scratched his skin. The fluorescent buzz overhead drilling into his skull. Hayes' betrayal had gutted him. Left him hollow. But the news filtering through the guards, protests, resignations, the precinct cracking, lit a flicker of something new. Not hope, not yet, but a reckoning. He'd been a cop, a protector, a man who kept order. Now he was a pariah. His name a curse on every lip. The guard had slipped him a tablet yesterday. Against protocol. And he'd watched the feeds, crowds chanting Brooks's name. His face plastered as the villain. It wasn't supposed to end like this. A knock on the cell door jolted him. A deputy stepped in, younger than most, his eyes nervous. You've got a visitor, he said, unlocking the cuffs. 10 minutes. Callahan shuffled to the visitation room, expecting Baxter with some desperate plea strategy. Instead, it was an older man, grizzled and gray, his face etched with decades on the force. Tom Delaney, retired cop. Callahan's first partner, the one who'd blown the whistle in Sarah's article. Callahan's blood ran cold as he sat, the glass between them a fragile barrier. Tom, he rasped, his voice hoarse. Why? Delaney leaned forward, his eyes weary but unflinching. You crossed a line. Jim, Deshawn, Jamal, it wasn't just you. But you let it happen. I kept quiet too long. Brooks gave me a chance to make it right. Callahan's fists clenched, his breath ragged. You sold me out. Hayes too. What's left of us? Nothing, Delaney said, his voice low. That's the point. You built this mess. I just lit the match. Live with it. The guard called time, and Delaney left without looking back. Callahan sat, staring at the empty chair, the weight of his sins crashing down. That night, he asked for a pen and paper, a first in weeks. He started writing, slow, halting, a confession of sorts. I thought I was the law. I was wrong. Outside, the city shifted. The precinct announced a review board, a hollow gesture to appease the crowds. Evelyn met with Lena that afternoon, handing over the car note as evidence, pushing for wider charges. By evening, Ruth stood at a 5th Ward rally, her voice trembling but clear over a megaphone. My girl's fighting for us, for Jeremiah, for Jamal, for all of him. Don't let him scare us quiet. The crowd roared, a wave of defiance Evelyn felt from miles away. She sat at her desk that night, drafting a response to the governor. I accept the nomination. Let's talk. Marcus watched, a rare smile breaking through. You're gonna shake the whole damn state, he said. Maybe, she replied, her pen pausing. But it's not about me. It's about them. Jamal, Deshawn, Mama, we're not done. In his cell, Callahan scratched another line. She won't stop. Neither should I. The pen trembled, but he kept going. The words a lifeline in the dark. Houston burned and rebuilt around them. A city caught between ashes and hope. Its future hanging on the edge of a gavel, and the hands that wielded it. Chapter 8. The scales tip. The air in Evelyn Brooks's apartment was thick with the scent of coffee and determination as she sat at her dining table. A draft of her acceptance speech for the appellate court nomination spread out before her. It was late October now, the Houston heat finally giving way to a crisp breeze that rattled the blinds. Ruth hummed softly in the kitchen, stirring a pot of gumbo, her presence a steady anchor amid the storm that had engulfed their lives. Evelyn's pen hovered over the page, her words sharp and deliberate. Justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. And I've been fighting my whole life. She'd meet the governor tomorrow. A formality turned spotlight with the city still reeling from Callahan's fall and Hayes' confessions. But the fight wasn't over, not while threats lingered. Not while the system she'd vowed to serve still harbored rot. Marcus slumped in the chair across from her, his laptop glowing with updates. Lena's got the grand jury locked in, he said, rubbing his eyes. Hayes is spilling more every day, names, payoffs, even a stash of burner phones they used to coordinate. Callahan's trial's set for mid-November, but they're fast-tracking Martinez and the others. Next week. Evelyn nodded, her gaze fixed on the speech. Good. The sooner they're down, the sooner we can breathe. What about the precinct? Still bleeding, Marcus said, scrolling. 5 more resignations today, brass included. The review board's a joke. But the feds are stepping in. Sarah says they're auditing 10 years of cases. Could be dozens like Deshaun and Jamal. She set the pen down, her fingers drumming the table. That's what I'm afraid of. This isn't just Callahan or Hayes, it's a machine. We've cracked it, but it's still running. Ruth shuffled in, a bowl of gumbo in her hands, her silver curls catching the light. You're chipping at it, baby, she said, setting the bowl in front of Evelyn. That's more than most ever done. Eat. Can't fight on an empty stomach. Evelyn smiled faintly, the warmth of the broth easing the knot in her chest. Thanks, Mama, but it's not enough yet. They hit your house, my car. They're still out there. And you're still here, Ruth countered, her voice firm. They tried to break us before, with your daddy. Didn't work then, won't now. The room fell quiet, the weight of memory settling over them. Evelyn took a spoonful, the flavors grounding her, then pushed the bowl aside. Marcus, get me everything Sarah's dug up, every name Hayes gave. We're not waiting for the feds. I want a list for the governor tomorrow. He nodded, typing fast. On it. You're really doing this? Going after the whole damn thing? Every piece, she said, her eyes hard. If I'm on that bench, it's not just a seat, it's a weapon. Across town, James Callahan sat in his cell, the pen in his hand trembling as he scratched another line onto the yellow legal pad. The stack of pages had grown over weeks, rambling at first. Then sharper, a confession spilling out in fits and starts. I thought I was keeping order. Didn't see the blood on my hands, till it dried. The guards had started slipping him extra paper. A quiet nod to the man he'd been. Or maybe just pity. He didn't care. Writing was all he had left, a mirror he couldn't look away from. The door clanged open, and Baxter, his lawyer, stepped in, his suit rumpled, his face drawn. Jim, he said, dropping into the chair across the glass. We've got a problem. Hayes' deal's locked, 10 years. And he's naming names like it's a damn memoir. They're piling on you. Manslaughter for Deshaun. Conspiracy for Jamal. Life's on the table. Callahan's pen stilled, his breath shallow. Life, he echoed, the word a stone in his throat. Hayes sold me out. He sold everyone out, Baxter said, leaning forward. But we've got a shot, temporary insanity. Stress, PTSD, the works. You play it right, we could cut it to 20. Maybe less. Callahan stared at the pad. The ink smudged where his hand had rested. 20 years, he muttered. And then what? I'm nothing without the badge. You're alive, Baxter snapped. That's more than Martinez might get. They're toast. Hayes gave him up too. Take the deal, Jim, or you're buried. He didn't answer, just resumed writing, the pen digging into the paper. Baxter sighed, gathering his briefcase. Think it over. Clocks ticking. The door shut, and Callahan was alone again. The words flowing. I built a cage for others. Didn't know I'd end up in it. Outside, the city shifted under pressure. The precinct's review board collapsed under federal scrutiny, replaced by an independent task force. Protests had calmed, but the anger simmered, graffiti on cop cars. Vigils in Fifth Ward. A quiet march past Ruth's patched-up bungalow. Evelyn drove there that afternoon. Ruth beside her, to meet the neighbors who'd guarded the house since the break-in. They greeted her with hugs. Stories. A plate of cornbread, community forged in shared scars. "You're our voice now," an older woman named Clara said, her hands rough from factory work. "Don't let him forget us." "I won't," Evelyn promised, her throat tight. She left with their strength in her bones. Driving back to prepare for the governor. The next morning, she stood in his office downtown. A sleek space of glass and mahogany. Governor Ellis, a graying man with a politician's smile, shook her hand. "Judge Brooks," he said, gesturing to a chair, "you've stirred quite a pot. The people love you. Polls are through the roof. Appellate court's yours if you want it." "I do," she said, sitting, her briefcase open with Marcus's list, names, dates, a roadmap of corruption. "But I'm not here to play nice. This is what's still out there, cops. Brass. A system that's rotten. I'll take the bench, but I'm bringing this with me." Ellis skimmed the list, his smile fading. "You're asking for a war." "It's already here," she said, her voice steel. "I'm just picking my side." He leaned back, exhaling. "All right, you're in. But watch your back. Those threats aren't idle." "I've been watching it my whole life," she replied, standing. "I'll manage." That night, Callahan's trial loomed closer. He finished another page. "She's stronger than I ever was. I broke, she didn't." He slid it under his cot. A guard collecting it later, unsigned. But known. Word spread among inmates, he was writing. Confessing. Unraveling. Some sneered, others nodded. A quiet respect forming. Evelyn sat with Marcus and Ruth. The TV showing the latest. Martinez's team pleading out. Collins turning state's evidence. Pierce facing life. The dominoes were falling. She turned it off, facing her mother. "You were right, Mama. We're chipping away." Ruth smiled, her eyes bright. "Keep swinging, baby. That's all we've ever done." In his cell, Callahan stared at the ceiling. The pen idle for the first time. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollow piece. He'd lost everything, badge, brothers, freedom, but the words remained. A lifeline he'd cling to as the bars closed in. Houston settled into an uneasy calm. The ashes of its old order smoldering. Evelyn's shadow lengthening over it all. The scales had tipped, not fully. Not yet, but enough to feel the shift. Chapter 9. The Rise and the Forgotten. The Houston winter crept in slow and gray. A rare chill settling over the city as Evelyn Brooks stood before the mirrored glass of her new office in the Texas Appellate Court building. It was early December, 2 months since Callahan's courtroom collapse had set everything in motion, and the view from the 9th floor stretched across a skyline that felt both familiar and foreign. Her robe hung on a rack by the door, no longer the worn garment of a district judge but a crisp, tailored symbol of her ascent. The governor's handshake had sealed it, a unanimous confirmation after weeks of hearings, protests, and backroom deals. She'd taken the bench last week, her first ruling already cited in legal briefs across the state, a sharp rebuke of a police misconduct case that had lingered too long in the lower courts. Evelyn Brooks was no longer just a name in Houston, she was a force. A reckoning. Her desk was cluttered with files, a laptop glowing with emails, and a framed photo of Ruth smiling at the Fifth Ward rally. Her silver curls defiant against the wind. Marcus had moved with her, now her chief clerk, his desk a chaotic mirror of hers in the next room. He poked his head in, his tie loose, a stack of papers under his arm. "You see the news?" he asked, dropping into a chair. "Martinez and Collins took pleas, 15 years each. Pierce's trial starts Monday, but he's toast. Hayes' testimony buried him." Evelyn leaned against the window, the cold glass pressing through her blazer. "Good," she said, her voice steady but tired. "That's 3 down. Callahan's next." Marcus nodded, flipping through his stack. "November 15th, 2 days from now. Lena's pushing for life on the manslaughter charge. Plus 20 for conspiracy. Baxter's flailing. Temporary insanity's all he's got. But the jury's not buying it after Hayes." She turned, her eyes narrowing. "They shouldn't. He's not crazy, he's guilty. And he knows it." The weight of her words hung between them. A quiet acknowledgement of the war they'd fought and won. At least this far. The precinct had hemorrhaged under federal audits. A dozen officers indicted, the chief stepping down in disgrace. Protests had tapered off, replaced by a wary hope. Vigils in Fifth Ward. Community forums. A slow rebuilding. But the backlash lingered. Her inbox brimmed with hate. Race traitor. Activist in a robe. You'll pay. A brick had crashed through her apartment window last week. Narrowly missing Ruth, who'd laughed it off with a grit Evelyn envied. The threats were noise now. A dull roar she'd learned to tune out. She'd faced worse and stood taller for it. Ruth had moved in permanently. Her bungalow too exposed. Her spirit too vital to leave behind. She'd taken to baking cornbread for the office staff. Her voice a steady hum through the halls as she recounted stories of Jeremiah's marches. "You're his legacy, baby," she'd said last night, pressing a warm slice into Evelyn's hands. "Keep going." And Evelyn had. Every ruling. Every late night. Every step up this ladder built on scars. The governor's office had pushed her nomination hard. Riding the wave of public support, polls showed her approval soaring among Houston's Black and Latino communities. A hero forged in fire. But the conservative flank fought back. Blogs decried her as a diversity pick. Talk radio hosts sneered at her agenda. And a state senator had called her confirmation a slap to law enforcement. She'd faced them in hearings. Unflinching. Her answers cutting through their bluster. "I'm here because I earned it." Justice doesn't bend for your comfort. The vote had been close. But it was hers. Marcus stood, stretching. "You're meeting the DA tomorrow. Lena wants your input on Pierce. And Sarah's got a book deal, The Fall of the Blue Line. You're chapter 1. Evelyn smirked, a rare crack in her armor. She earned it. "Tell Lena I'll be there." Pierce doesn't walk. He grinned, heading out, but paused at the door. "You're changing things, Evie. They're scared of you up here." "They should be," she said, turning back to the window. The city sprawled below, a patchwork of hope and hurt. And she felt its pulse in her bones. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. Miles away, James Callahan sat in a courtroom holding cell. His trial 2 days off. His world a shrinking box of concrete and steel. The jumpsuit chafed, the air stale, but the legal pad under his cot was his lifeline. He'd filled dozens of pages now, confessions, regrets, a jagged map of the man he'd been. "I thought I was the wall between chaos and order. I was the chaos." The guards had stopped mocking him. Some slipping him coffee, others reading his words in quiet shifts. Word had spread, he was breaking. Or maybe mending. And the inmates watched with a mix of scorn and curiosity. His trial loomed like a guillotine. Hayes' plea had gutted his defense. Every name he dropped another nail in Callahan's coffin. Martinez and Collins had folded. Pierce was next. And Callahan was the last domino. The one they'd pin it all on. Baxter visited daily, his optimism fading. "Life's on the table, Jim," he'd said yesterday, his voice flat. "Take the 20-year deal. Best we'll get." Callahan hadn't answered, just kept writing. 20 years or life, it didn't matter. The badge was gone. His name a curse. His brothers scattered or snitching. He'd seen the news on a smuggled phone, Brooks on the appellate court. Her rulings sharp as knives. The precinct crumbling. She'd won. And he'd lost everything. But the words kept coming. A slow bleed of truth. "She saw what I couldn't. I hated her for it." The cell door opened, and a guard tossed in a newspaper, the Chronicle. Sarah's latest piece. The judge who broke Houston's blue wall. Evelyn's face stared back, stern and unyielding, a caption noting her rise. Callahan traced the photo with a trembling finger, his breath catching. She'd been the shadow he'd tried to crush. And now she towered over him. He tore the page out, tucking it into his stack, and wrote, "I'm nobody now. She's everything." Outside, Houston moved on. The protests had quieted, but the signs remained. Justice lives painted on Fifth Ward walls. A mural of Jamal and Deshawn rising near Ruth's old house. Evelyn's rulings sparked debate. Law reviews praised her clarity. Conservatives decried her bias. But her name echoed in classrooms and courtrooms alike. She met Lena that afternoon, laying out Pierce's case. No mercy. No deals. He ends this chain. she told the DA. Her voice iron. Lena agreed, her own fire stoked by Evelyn's lead. Ruth hosted a small dinner that night. Marcus, Sarah, a few Fifth Ward neighbors, gumbo and cornbread filling the apartment with warmth. To my girl, Ruth toasted, raising a glass of sweet tea. You're climbing higher than we ever dreamed. Evelyn smiled, but her eyes were distant, fixed on the battles ahead. Callahan faded from the headlines. His trial a footnote as Pierce's loomed larger. Inmates stopped whispering his name. Guards moved on, his stack of pages growing dust under the cot. He wrote less now, the pen heavy, his confession complete but unheard. I'm a ghost, he scrawled one night, then set it aside. The world had turned, and he was left behind. A shadow swallowed by the light Evelyn cast. She stood at her window after dinner, the city twinkling below. Marcus at her side. Supreme Court next? He teased, nudging her. Maybe, she said, her voice soft but resolute. But first, we finish what we started here. The appellate court awaited, a new battlefield, and Evelyn Brooks was ready, her rise unstoppable, her roots unyielding, a judge who'd turned ashes into a legacy. Chapter 10. The Weight of the Echoes. The Houston spring arrived with a tentative warmth. The air soft and green as Evelyn Brooks stood on the steps of the Texas Appellate Court building, her robe catching the breeze. It was March now, 4 months since Callahan's trial had ended, and the city had settled into a fragile new rhythm. The skyline glittered behind her, a testament to resilience, but the scars of the past year lingered, etched in murals, whispered in courtrooms, carried in the hearts of those who'd fought and won. She'd just delivered a ruling overturning a wrongful conviction from 2015. A black man freed after 8 years behind bars, his family weeping in the gallery. It was her 10th decision in as many weeks, each one a brick in the wall she was building, a justice that didn't flinch, didn't bend, didn't forget. Inside her office, the walls bore the marks of her tenure, plaques from community groups, a photo of Ruth at the Fifth Ward rally, a letter from the governor hinting at a Supreme Court nod if she kept this pace. Marcus sat at his desk, now a permanent fixture, his tie crisp as he sorted through briefs. Pierce got life this morning, he called out, not looking up. No parole. Lena says it's the last nail. Martinez, Collins, him, all down. Evelyn leaned against her doorway, arms crossed. Good, she said, her voice steady. Hayes still talking? Like a damn audiobook. Marcus replied, a grin tugging at his lips. Feds are up to 20 indictments, cops, clerks, even a judge from '09. You started a landslide, Evie. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. Callahan's trial had closed in November, life without parole for Deshaun Lewis' death. 20 years concurrent for conspiracy in Jamal Carter's. His confession, those scribbled pages smuggled out by a guard, had leaked to Sarah's book, The Fall of the Blue Line, now a bestseller dissected in law schools and talk shows. It hadn't saved him, but it had shifted something. Jurors citing it, protesters quoting it, a crack in the silence he'd once wielded like a shield. Evelyn hadn't read it, she didn't need to, she'd lived it. The city had changed too. The precinct was under federal oversight, a new chief promising transparency. Though skepticism lingered in Fifth Ward, Ruth's bungalow stood repaired, a community hub now, her cornbread a staple at weekly meetings where neighbors planned the next fight. Housing, schools, jobs. Evelyn visited when she could, her mother's voice a tether to the ground she'd risen from. You're Jeremiah's girl, Ruth had said last week, pressing her hand. He'd be proud. Evelyn had smiled, but the weight of that pride pressed heavy, every win a reminder of those she couldn't save. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Supreme Court rumors heating up. Dinner tonight? Evelyn typed back. Yes. Bring wine. She'd need it. The nomination talk had grown louder. Legal scholars praising her rulings. Conservatives grumbling but losing ground. Threats still came. Letters. Calls. A slashed tire last month, but they were echoes now, fading against the roar of her work. She'd hired security for Ruth, moved to a new apartment with Marcus's help, her life a fortress built on resolve. Across the state, in a Huntsville prison cell, James Callahan sat on his cot, the walls bare except for a single photo taped up, Evelyn from that Chronicle article. Her face a ghost he couldn't shake. His hair had grayed, his frame thinner, the jumpsuit a second skin after months inside. The legal pad was gone, confiscated after the leak, but the words stayed with him, etched in his mind. I broke what I swore to protect. She fixed it. He didn't write anymore, nothing left to say, but the inmates knew his story. Some nodding in passing, others spitting at his feet. He'd faded from the news. A name lost to time. His trial a footnote to Pierce's louder fall. A guard rapped on the bars, tossing in a letter. No return address. Postmarked Houston. Callahan opened it slow, his fingers unsteady. A single line in neat script. You're not forgotten. But you're finished. No signature. But he knew, Brooks. He stared at it, his breath catching, then crumpled it, letting it fall. The guard watched, silent, and Callahan leaned back, the weight of her words sinking in. She'd won, not just the fight, but the war he'd never seen coming. Back in Houston, Evelyn met Sarah at a quiet diner. The clink of glasses a soft backdrop to their talk. Supreme Court's a long shot, Sarah said, pouring wine, but you've got the chops. They're scared of you in D.C. Let him be, Evelyn said, sipping. I'm not chasing it, I'm building it here. If it comes, I'll take it. Sarah grinned. You're a damn legend already. Books selling out. Chapter 1's you. Start to finish. Evelyn smirked, but her eyes were distant. It's not about me, Sarah. It's about them. Jamal. Deshaun. Daddy. Everyone we lost. The diner faded tonight, and Evelyn drove home. Ruth waiting with gumbo and a smile. Marcus joined them, the trio a quiet unit against the world. You're not stopping, are you? He asked. Spooning broth. Never, she said, her voice soft but iron. We've got work to do. The next day, she stood in her office. A new case file open, another cop. Another cover-up, a thread to pull. She wrote her ruling with precision, each word a strike against the dark. Whispers of her name grew, Supreme Court. A distant drum, but she focused here. Now, the gavel her tool, her will her weapon. In Huntsville, Callahan sat in the yard. The sun weak overhead, inmates shuffling past. A new prisoner, a kid from 5th Ward, eyed him. You're that cop, huh? He said, voice low. The one she took down. Callahan nodded, his gaze empty. Yeah, that's me. The kid smirked, walking off. Good riddance. Callahan watched him go, the echo of Brooks's note ringing in his skull. He was a ghost now. A cautionary tale, his power dust in her hands. Houston moved forward, its wounds healing slow. Ruth's rally cry echoed in community halls. Marcus dug into new cases. Sarah's book sparked debates. Evelyn's rulings piled up, each one a step, a promise. The Supreme Court loomed, a shadow on the horizon. But she didn't look up, not yet. She looked down, to the streets, the people, the fight she'd sworn to finish. One night, she stood at her window. The city quiet below. Ruth joined her, her hand on Evelyn's shoulder. You did it, baby, she said. You made him listen. Not yet, Evelyn replied, her voice a vow. But I will. In his cell, Callahan closed his eyes. The photo of her peeling from the wall. The echoes of his fall faded. Hers rose, and the scales of justice tipped, slow, sure, unyielding, toward a dawn she'd forged from the dark.